The air inside the San Bartolome Parish in Magalang, Pampanga during the early 1800s was not filled with the scent of holiness. It was thick with the smell of damp stone, burnt beeswax, and a secret that was beginning to rot. To the villagers, Father Juan Severino Malari was a saint in a black cassock. He was the first Filipino priest to be ordained in the province, a brilliant scholar who had conquered the Latin of the Spaniards and the hearts of the poor. But as the tropical sun dipped behind the jagged, ink-black peaks of Mount Arayat, the father was not praying for his flock. He was hunting them. Between 1816 and 1826, 57 people would vanish into the tall, whispering stalks of the sugarcane. Mothers, laborers, children, swallowed by the humid night without a trace. The Spanish civil guard in Manila were baffled. They searched for bandits, they searched for rebels. They never searched the Rectory, because Father Malari wasn't killing for gold or for lust or for power. He was killing for a curse. He believed his elderly mother had been hexed by a mangkukulam, a witch, and a dark, ancient logic had taken hold of his brilliant mind. For every life he took, the curse on his mother would weaken. For every drop of blood spilled, the kulam would recede. This is the record of Juan Severino Malari, the first and only serial killer priest in Philippine history, a man who tried to bargain with heaven using the currency of hell.
To understand the descent of Father Malari, we must first look at the crushing weight of being the first. In the early 19th century, the Catholic Church in the Philippines was a fortress of Spanish power. Filipino priests, known as seculars, were rare. They were the intellectual elite of the local population, yet they were constantly watched by the Spanish friars, who doubted their loyalty and their faith. Juan Malari was different. Born into a wealthy family in Magalang, he was a child of the Enlightenment. He was a calligrapher, a musician, and a theologian. When he walked the dusty streets of his parish, the people knelt. He was the proof that a Filipino could hold the keys to the kingdom of God.
But Malari's world was centered on one person, his mother, Doña Maria. She was his anchor. But in 1815, the anchor began to drag. She fell into a mysterious, wasting sickness. Her skin turned gray, her eyes clouded over, and she began to whisper to things in the corners of her room that no one else could see. Malari spent every peso he had on Spanish doctors. They bled her with leeches. They gave her bitter tinctures of European herbs. Nothing worked. It was in this moment of scientific failure that the Etched Mystery began. The priest, the man of Latin and logic, turned back toward the dark folklore of the provinces.
When the Spanish medicine failed, Malari began to look into the shadows of the village. He knew that beneath the thin veneer of Catholic prayer, the old ways still breathed. He began to obsess over the kulam, the ancient Philippine art of the curse. In the 1820s, a mangkukulam was a figure of absolute dread. It was believed they could kill without ever touching their victim. They used the barang, a jar of beetles or centipedes that acted as their soldiers. They would take a strand of the victim's hair, a piece of their clothing, or even their footprint in the mud, and tie it to a doll made of rags and needles.
Malari began to spend his nights reading forbidden manuscripts. He looked for the signs. He believed that for every needle pushed into a doll in some hidden hut, a needle was pushing into his mother's heart. He became convinced that the only way to sever the thread of the curse was through the transfer of life. In the dark theology that was forming in his mind, the kulam was like a scale that had been tipped. To bring his mother's side of the scale up, he had to push the other side down with death. He theorized that a witch's power was like a parasite. If the parasite was feeding on his mother, he would provide fresher blood to distract it. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a self-appointed exorcist of the blade, trying to out-magic the witch at her own game. The first kill happened in the late rainy season of 1816. A local farmhand was walking home through the outskirts of the town. The mud was thick, and the rain muffled the sound of footsteps. Father Malari was waiting in the shadows of a large bolete tree, a place the locals already feared as a portal for spirits. The priest did not use a gun. He used a da hong palais, a long, narrow knife used for clearing brush. It was silent. It was efficient. As the man fell, Malari did not feel guilt. He felt a surge of holy purpose. He hurried back to the rectory, his cassock stained with the red clay of the fields, and rushed to his mother's side. To his fractured mind, she looked better. Her skin seemed warmer. The delusion was locked in. The priest had found his medicine.
The victims were chosen with the precision of a predator. A widow who lived on the edge of the forest. A traveler staying at a local inn. A sacristan who stayed too late at the church. Malari used the silence of the confessional to his advantage. People would come to him, weeping, telling him about their missing loved ones. They would confess their fears, never realizing they were kneeling before the very thing they were afraid of. Imagine the woodcut of this scene. The candlelit confessional box. On one side, a crying woman. On the other, the priest, his eyes cold and dark, his hand resting on the hilt of a hidden blade, listening to the secrets of the town he was slowly destroying. He killed 57 people. This wasn't a spree, it was a 10-year ritual. Each death was a desperate attempt to keep his mother from the grave. He was a man trapped in a loop of madness, believing that the Holy Mother Church would forgive a son who killed for his mother's life.
The Spanish authorities in Manila eventually sent investigators to Pampanga. They weren't looking for a killer. They were investigating reports of banditry and peasant unrest. The local officials were embarrassed that they couldn't catch the phantom of the cane fields who had been thinning the population for a decade. The end came in 1826. A young Spanish priest was sent to assist the aging Malari, whose health and mind were clearly fracturing. The young man noticed that the father never let anyone into certain rooms of the rectory. He noticed that the father's piousness felt like a heavy, suffocating mask. But it was the smell that finally gave it away. It wasn't the smell of the victims themselves, but the smell of unwashed blood. In the humid, stagnant air of the rectory, the copper tang of the father's hidden blades and the metallic scent of stained cassocks hidden beneath the bed created a rot that the church's incense could no longer hide. The evidence of 57 lives had finally begun to breathe. When the civil guard finally raided the San Bartolome Rectory, they didn't find a witch's coven. They found a horrific collection of personal items from the 57 missing people. Ribbons, combs, and simple wooden crosses, trophies of a decade of slaughter, tucked away in drawers that smelled of iron and death. The trial of Father Malari in 1840 was a sensation that rocked the Spanish Empire. The documents from the Real Audiencia in Manila describe a man who was eerily calm. Malari did not beg for mercy. He spoke in perfect, formal Spanish, explaining his theology of murder. He argued that he was a soldier in a spiritual war, and the 57 victims were merely collateral in the fight against the Kulam. The Spanish judges were horrified. To them, he was a monster who had desecrated the holy orders. To the Filipino people, he was a tragedy, a brilliant son who had been swallowed by the very darkness he was supposed to fight.
In the early morning of 1840, Father Juan Severino Malari was led to the gallows at the Bagumbayan field in Manila, the same place where revolutionaries would later die. He wore his black cassock. He held his crucifix. He was the first Filipino priest to be executed by the state. His mother had died shortly after his arrest. The curse was never broken by blood. It was only broken by the rope. The records of his crimes were largely suppressed by the church for over a century. They didn't want the world to remember the priest who killed for a curse. But some stories refuse to stay buried. They are etched in the soil of the sugarcane fields, waiting for the rain to reveal the bones. The archives are closed for now.